Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Thank you for listening to the Sales for the Nigerian Wedding Industry podcast. I'm your host, Abuja based event and wedding photographer, Tavishima Ayede. So, thank you guys for hanging on and welcome to the second day where we're exploring the overarching question of whether we should talk to strangers, whether we should call strangers. Because I'm sure you remember back when we were little kids, it was gospel that was preached to every single kid in the neighborhood, my parents including, do not talk to strangers. Now, some people think that that is part of the psychology that has carried over into a lot of us who are involved in business these days, not wanting to talk to strangers because we don't want to be impolite and we don't want to interrupt, and so a few of us have to keep looking into this issue every now and then on whether indeed we should be talking to strangers and how and what is the best way. And put it that way, what's the best way to talk to strangers? Because let's face it, if you're involved in business, for those of us who are in the wedding and event space, or whether you do agriculture, banking, insurance, or whatever, at some point the prospect that you're going to talk to, the prospective customer that you're going to talk to at some point is going to be a stranger. Eventually, yes, you guys become friends, but we can't run away from that question of whether we should talk to strangers and what is the best way to talk to strangers. Now, for those of you who are just catching the show for the first time, this is a detour from the previous range of topics that we had been discussing. We had looked at the complex sale, the simple sales, and we're going to go on to whether pressure should be applied in sales. But the reason why we're talking about these sorts of issues today, about talking to strangers, is because I received some interesting phone calls a few days ago. And I just thought that there were a couple of things that we wedding and event industry professionals could learn from that. So now, on to the question. Okay, I think yesterday, if I remember correctly, we went over how to talk to strangers, how to call strangers, should you talk to them, why it's a good idea, what the best case scenario is, what the worst case scenario is, and overall why it's a good idea to call strangers. So now that we're settled on that question, I hope, let's move on to should you identify yourself during the call. Now, the reason why I'm bringing that up is because these two calls, for those of you who remember in the last episode, started off in very different ways. Now, the fellow who called me from Sterling Bank, the fellow who was selling Islamic banking, as I like to call it, or non-interest banking, interest-free banking, or whatever the what I say, pseudonyms or whatever that they have for the service. So whatever names they've come up with. So when he started off the phone call, he started off by asking, he said, "Good morning. Am I speaking to Tavishima George Ayede?" And I said, yes. Yes, this is. What's your name and how can I help? And then the conversation moved along from there. Now, the other fellow who was calling because he wanted to supply agricultural produce for our second business, which is Dove Agro Seeds, he picked up the phone, he dialed, I answered, and strange as it may sound, he started off by saying, "Good morning, sir. You are on to so and so from Abia State." Now, I found that kind of odd because that's not the typical way that most Nigerians lead into a phone call. They don't start off by, announcing their name from the get-go. Definitely not in those sorts of terms. So, oh, good morning, you're on to Tavishima Ayede from Benue State. Now, that's an odd way of beginning the phone call. And immediately kind of put me off because my phone number is on a lot of public forums. So it's on my Instagram, it's on the website, it's on YouTube, it's all over the place. So I receive phone calls from 419ers all the time. In fact, sometimes I think some people call and they might just be pranksters. I mean, it's mischief, but sometimes I don't perceive any ill intent. So I receive loads of phone calls, and so him starting off that way, I just immediately went into what's this call about? Can you get straight to the point? And that was my attitude basically throughout the whole phone call. And this is not just a Nigerian debate of whether you should identify yourself or not, because on loads of other podcasters that I listen to, there's the Grant Cardone Show, B2B Sales, what else? The Sales Whisperer, why people buy, sales influence, all those other podcasts out there. Every once in a while, those are the sorts of things that come up. That when you pick up the phone, you call the stranger, should you identify yourself immediately? Or should you launch straight into the presentation immediately? Or, I mean, should you do some other stuff? Now, there's argument that can be made on both ends on whether you should start by introducing yourself, identifying yourself, or to start by jumping straight into the problem. Now, whether you should identify yourself or not, the answer, of course, is yes. Eventually, if you don't start off by introducing yourself in the beginning, like the fellow who called from Sterling Bank about Islamic banking, he started off by confirming my identity and then leading straight into the problem. And at the end of the day, we got into who he was, what his name is, and if I'm interested in setting up the account or setting up a meeting, who I should talk to, and things of that nature. So you'll see that eventually you are going to have to identify yourself at some point, especially if the person is interested. But in my own opinion, I think when you're calling people calling people who are strangers, they don't know you. It's a totally cold situation, an emotionally cold context. They don't give a hoot who you are because you have interrupted them cold and they just want to know what is this about. So, for the mother who has just dropped off her kids in school, for instance, and who has left her phone number with all the teachers, she might see the call and she'll be wondering, oh, is this from the school? Or could it be auntie from the village? I mean, it could be anything really. So, I believe that when you pick up the call and you're calling a total stranger, I believe that you should confirm the identity because, first of all, you want to be sure you're talking to the right person. So there's no point in calling and saying, this is Tavishima Ayede from Benue State. Sorry, how did he start it again? He said you are on to. There's no point in picking up the phone and saying, you are on to Tavishima Ayede from Benue State, and then going into the whole thing about agricultural produce. If, for instance, it was a wrong number, and you're actually speaking to, let's say, Chukudi Eze, and let's say he's into construction and he doesn't know anything at all about agricultural produce and sales, and he's not interested. So, first of all, you need to confirm when you pick up the phone. Are you speaking to Mr. Ayede? Are you speaking to Mr. Ayede of Dove Agro Seeds? I think that's the first thing that you need to confirm. Or are you speaking to Mr. Ayede of Ayede Film and Photography? Are you speaking to Mr. Chukudi of ABC Construction Company? You need to confirm. And I think that should be the first thing to do. So you pick up the phone and then you confirm. Yesterday, with the example that I gave about the wedding planner, about people who've been stalking you on your Instagram profile and they're strangers, but you think it would be a nice idea to reach out to them because they've been liking everything you put up for the last 3 weeks, and you think, you've had a look at the profile and you think she's single, maybe she's planning a wedding. So that's the first thing you do. You pick up the phone and you say, hello, is this Ezine Chukudi? So yes, this is. And then you can get to the point of now identifying yourself. My name is Kemi from ABC Wedding Planning. And of course, since she's been liking your stuff for the last 3 weeks, of course you remember like, okay, ABC Wedding Planning. Oh, yes. And then the conversation will just flow nicely from there. Oh, I've seen you've been liking some of my stuff and blah, 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 and on and on. I believe I gave a scenario yesterday where we ran through some possibilities. So if this is your first time of listening to the show, just listen to yesterday's recording and then you'll see how I just fleshed out the scenario over there. So make sure, confirm the identity of the person that you're talking to. That is the most important thing, in my own opinion. And then after that, you will now dive into the subject matter at hand. So, like with the fellow from Sterling Bank, am I speaking to Tavishima George Ayede of Ayede Film and Photography? Yes, you are. Yes, you are. How can I help? And then he went on. The reason why I'm calling is because a friend or associate of yours left your phone number with us. He thought that you might be interested in some of the services that we offer. And of course, I asked, what is this about? And then he went on to, have you ever heard of interest-free banking? And my response was, is that Islamic banking? And to his credit, he didn't dodge it, he just bit the bullet. He answered, yes. And the conversation went on from there. So you see that was a much more structured, measured, deliberate approach, which didn't waste time and went straight to the issue. And because it was well thought out, it avoided, well, for me anyway, and I think for most people, I think it avoids some of the apprehension and some of the suspicion that you encounter when a total stranger, when you receive the phone call from a total stranger. Unlike the other approach, which started off with, you are on to Namdi Chukudu of Abia State, so, and so. Okay, so let's see. Let me back up a bit. I want to be sure I'm not winding all over the place. So I've gone over. Yes, you identify yourself eventually. But it's more important to confirm the identity of the person that you're speaking with, and then you can launch into the subject matter. And when you launch into the subject matter, do not go straight into your presentation, because the conversation would have been different for Sterling Bank if the fellow said, "Is this Tawishima Georgia Ede?" And then I said yes, and then the person went into the whole his presentation. Where Sterling Bank, we've been in Nigeria since 1950, whatever. We are the fifth biggest number, whatever, on the Nigerian Stock Exchange with this, that. I mean, that's just a complete waste of time. You move into relevance and suitability, which is what he did. Some people, your friends or associates, have left your phone numbers with us, and they think that we have some services that would be able to help in your wedding photography. That's straight to how this phone call is relevant. And the rest of the question was the rest of the conversation was on how suitable it is for my needs. Have you heard of non-interest banking? Is non-interest banking something you would be interested in? That means you'll be able to have access to loans without collateral, but of course there will be a fee attached to those services. These are sorts of things that you're interested in, and on and on and on. And that's how the conversation proceeded. So, okay, not to beat about the bush, I think this is a convenient place to just wind up this conversation. So, should you identify yourself? Of course, you should. Whether you should do it in the beginning, it's a matter of style, and that depends on you. But eventually, you're going to have to introduce yourself. Um, Eventually, you're going to have to introduce yourself, especially if the person is interested, because it's going to come up. Because when we started talking about me coming in to schedule an interview, of course, I had to know who am I speaking with, when am I supposed to come in, when I do, who am I supposed to ask for, if I'm going to set up the forms, who am I going to talk to. So, yes, the identity became an issue later on in the conversation. So, start off by confirming the identity. You want to be sure that you're speaking to the right person, and then you move into why this call is relevant to the person that you're calling. The reason why I'm calling you is because you've been following me on my Instagram handle for the last 3 weeks. You've liked X and X and X number of posts, and so I figured perhaps you might be planning a wedding. That's the reason why I'm calling. Is that the case? And that's not a bad way to start off the conversation if you are a wedding planner. And then after that, you move into why. So we've confirmed the identity, and then we've moved into relevance. And then from there, we'll now go into suitability. The whole thing about these are my packages, these are the rates, depending on the number of people and this and this and that, and the whole regular spiel. After that, you can move into your regular presentation because you've laid an effective groundwork. So, tomorrow I would like, okay, well, if I get to record tomorrow, let's just say at the next recording, I would like to look into whether we should freestyle or not, and whether we should have a framework for the conversation. For those of you who are long-time listeners, I'm sure you know by now where I already land on the matter. But for those of you who are newbies, I guess you'll wait until tomorrow to find out what my opinion is, or you can just go back a couple episodes. We have, I think we're over 100 episodes now. So you go back and you listen to previous episodes and you will find out where I land on the matter. But for now, I hope I have firmly convinced you and not confused you guys that, first of all, it's okay to call strangers because they might need your product or your service. The best case scenario is they're interested. The worst case scenario is that they don't need your service and you just say thank you very much for taking the call and you move on. And then in a mild case scenario, you generate some interest or you generate some awareness. They might not be interested, but now they know that that Kemi of ABC Wedding Planning exists. And then on the question of how we should proceed with the call, I hope I've convinced you guys that it's not important whether your name comes up in the beginning or in the end. The most important thing is to be sure who you're talking to at the beginning of the conversation. and then establish why this call is relevant, and then show how your services are suitable to their circumstances. So, thank you very much for listening to the Sales for the Nigerian Wedding Industry podcast. I'm your host, Abuja based event and wedding photographer, Tavishima Ayede. I'll keep doing my best to provide you guys with juicy tips and tricks and what I think is the proper way for how we should use personal sales to grow our businesses. And when I say personal sales, I mean personal sales and selling that is apart from other disciplines like advertising, marketing, online, all the online stuff and branding. So thank you very much for listening. I'll catch you guys on the next episode.